Just a quick note on the audio on this one. Daniel's audio failed and we had to use the backup audio source. It doesn't sound great. We apologize. The rest of the videos this week do have good and clean audio, but this one unfortunately sounds a little wonky on Daniel's channel. We'll make sure that we avoid this in the future. Sorry, guys. SECfans.com. Week 3 is here. Going to talk about a couple of teams that are playing each other that we've already talked about once this year, and then got a few other games to discuss. Auburn, LSU, Notre Dame and Vandy, Ohio State, TCU, and Alabama and Ole Miss this week. Want to remind everybody that the subscriber reminders to y'all have been going really well. Also, the comment section has been on fire this year. So just want to remind everybody, if you haven't yet subscribed, please do subscribe. I think you'll like what we're doing, even if you disagree with us. And for those of y'all who think we might be a little bit crazy, we are 13-3 against the spread combined with our picks this year, and I am actually beating King Nerd Josh 7-1 versus his 6-2 so far this year. And y'all, this is even before we get data. So what we generally do is a computer model about 4 weeks into the season that has proven to be really successful the last few years. Before that, when there's not a lot of data and everything's in hypothetical land, is generally where we have our bigger misses. We've done pretty well this year. So I say that not to really toot our own horn, but to say in the comments, if you're going to tell us how crazy and dumb and we don't know what we're talking about we are, make sure you just back it up with data and we'll be happy to engage. All right, remember, subscribe. Here we go. Auburn, LSU. This one is, every year it's a huge game, Josh, and this year is no different. I think coming into this season, the thought was that Auburn was going to be another year for Gus as a contender down there in Auburn and maybe, back in the national championship discussion, and LSU might either be going in the wrong direction or a year or two out, but they kind of kicked the door open against Miami with that huge win in week 1. I want to talk both about things we like about these teams and things we don't like about these teams. We tend to get a little negative, so I want to make sure that we stay positive. But first, I'm going to go negative. So if you were to say if there was a concerning thing for each team, my picks, I'll give you my 2 picks and you tell me if you agree with them or if you have something different and which one you think is worse. For me, my concern if I'm an Auburn fan, and when we say our concerns, this is in the context of a team that's elite, a team that wants to win 11, 12 games in the regular season and be in the national championship discussion, because that's where a lot of these teams are. That's where the fans' expectations are. Okay, so if have a concern and I'm an Auburn fan, it's the red zone offense. And it's not just the red zone offense this year against Washington. It's the red zone offense every year under Gus's offense. And if I have a concern at LSU, it's the quarterback. And those are the 2 that I'm going with. You let me know if those are the 2 that you're going with and which one you'd be most concerned with.
It's interesting because you've picked scenarios or units, and personally, I would pick more personnel groupings, and I think the 2 things end up going the same. So when you started asking that question, my immediate response for Auburn this year is consistency at the offensive line, the ability to run the ball up the middle in particular, or just run the ball with power on direct runs. And my answer for LSU essentially is ability to get skill players the ball in space, or the ability to make explosive plays to generate points. Now, those 2 things put together are actually your answer, more or less. Would you agree?
Yeah, I was about to say that sounds a lot like what I was saying, but in a different way.
Right. So Auburn, you talked about red zone offense, and we see this off and on with them in recent years, and you can kind of track their success more or less based off how successful they are in the red zone. I think there's a good reason for that. Auburn's offense uses a lot of motion plays, a lot of receiver screens, misdirections, but all that stuff is really based off defenses not being able to really contain or to stop the inside run. And we've talked about this early in the season. We talked about it in our previews. Auburn's entire offense is more or less predicated on being able to do the power run, predicated on being able to do the dive play. Even when they do the zone read is only really effective when Auburn is able to run that inside run because the zone read, uh, when there's two ways to do it. You have an inside zone and an outside zone, and the difference is the running back going in either case, the running back is going to go inside or outside, and the quarterback's going to do the opposite. Uh, there's different ways to run it depending on the type of quarterback you have, but in the main thing you want to do in that offense is always run the inside play as your primary play. And you generally want to do that with a running back because you don't want your quarterback going into the teeth of a defense. If you've got a quarterback that can do it, those guys are pretty rare, but you can be pretty successful. Cam Newton did it. Tim Tebow do it. We've seen it with Nick Fitzgerald, who's starting to break a lot of SEC rushing records. So obviously, if you have that inside power, you can be really successful in a zone read offense. If you've got a quarterback that can run inside power, you can be incredibly successful. But you can also run an inside zone read where the running back is the inside power option, the quarterback stays outside. That's the Nick Marshall offense. But regardless, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, defense, stop the inside run first and foremost. And if you stop that inside run, then we're going to take Nick Marshall and we're going to run on the edge, or we're going to hit a Corey Grant on a jet sweep across. And all those things require the outside linebackers and the DNs to be biting in on the inside. It's a read. The quarterback is reading the DN, or he's reading an outside linebacker and making the call to go outside, or using the jet sweep to get leverage. That only works if they're crashing. And, since you brought this up, it's an interesting point that if you look at 2018, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, ... What are the 2 years they were in the top 40 in red zone offense? It was apparently, shockingly, 2017 and 2013. And every other year in recent years, they've been outside the top 40 in red zone scoring percentage. And I think it really just comes down to the fact that some years they can run that inside zone and some years they can't. This year, my concern with them is, successful as they have been, and that requires, I think, a big asterisk, because the Washington game obviously was a low-scoring, ugly game where the defense was good. And then last week against Alabama State wasn't much of a challenge. I don't know that they're doing enough to get teams to really play to that inside zone. And now that whole discussion, too, can be turned to LSU. We were pretty high on Canada, at least schematically. I understand the guy had a lot of personality issues. Can't really speak to that. It's not like we're beat reporters. But what Canada was really good at doing was kind of creating the same thing without having the mobile quarterback you really need. So they did a lot of stuff with motions and shifts. They did a lot of things with jet sweeps, power plays to the outside, and just ways to flip the ball to skill guys, to where if you were overplaying that inside run game, they could get something to the skill guy on the perimeter, even though they couldn't throw the ball overly effectively. And in that way, LSU, and to the same degree, could utilize skill players, even though they didn't have a downfield passing game with Etling, or at least not an effective one, if teams were struggling to stop the inside run. LSU this year has been a little more successful with the inside run, though I caution it wasn't consistently successful in that Miami game. Brissett had 5.7 yards per carry, but 50 yards of that came on one play, right? For the rest of it, he was only averaging 3.6 yards per carry in that LSU-Miami game. So both these teams, I think, have a concern with the fact that they're not running the ball up the middle with as much success as you'd like to see. I think in Auburn's case, I'm a little more impressed with the receivers, though, again, they didn't show up so much against Washington, and there were a lot of injuries. LSU, there's guys in the board, but I'm not sure I see another DJ Chark. So I think in both these teams' cases, I'm not sure they have the inside run game that we want to see, and I'm also not sure they have a way to sort of offset that offensively.
Yeah, and one of the things we mentioned going into the Auburn game was we felt like the Auburn Washington game, we felt like Auburn's receiving unit that had been a weakness in the past is poised to have a bigger year this year and to be more reliable this year. And I think they did show that. That they did take another step, but it was interesting because the takeaway for me in that game was Washington's wide receivers were borderline elite. They were incredible. We have said, and this is just going back to this thing that we've touched on so many times in the past, the thing that's always been really brutal about facing a Gus Malzahn offense when it's humming is not so much because everybody remembers like the high flying, the trick plays, the big scores, or the high scores, but really it's the inability to get them off the field on second and third down. Like every time you play them, it's not huge chunk plays as much as it is consistently moving the ball down the field. And I feel like he's still got that this year in terms of at least what we saw against Washington. Moving the ball was great. And being able to stay on the field is somewhat of a weapon and somewhat does help your defense. But at some point, they're going to face a team that's going to require them to put the ball in the end zone or lose. Did you see that again against Washington? Where I know you talked about the power run, but like on one hand, it was really good that they were able to move the ball down the field, and on the other hand, there are some warning signs and some things that concern you about the red zone offense.
I think so. When you look at the receiving core and what they were able to do, they had some success. Canella made a big catch that made all the highlight reels, but that was his only catch in the ball game.
Yeah, and wasn't that catch though sort of emblematic of what the problem is? Because that was a perfect throw and a highlight reel catch, and that was the only time all night, except for the late run that they had, where they really got in the end zone. And I think it was third down. I'm not sure, but doesn't the fact that they had to go to those links to get in the end zone kind of prove our point?
I would argue it should. Auburn's longest reception in that game was 25 yards, or 24 yards, I should say. They didn't have any plays of 25 yards or longer. And when Malzahn's been in his most dangerous, they have a lot of chunk plays. And we've talked about this a lot. Auburn's system and Oregon's system under Chip Kelly are different schematically in a number of different ways. They're both predicated on the zone read, but they're also really different. But one thing that they both have in common is as much as they're predicated on the zone read, they're also predicated on making you stop it with tempo. And then when you're getting used to it or you're trying to adjust and play downhill, the moment you get in a rhythm, they hit you over the top. And if you take that 2013 Auburn team, for example, when they played Alabama and they won the kick six game, their offense play to play was pretty terrible. They didn't move the ball with any consistency in that game almost whatsoever. What they did is they hit Nick Marshall for a 70-yard touchdown run. They hit a pop pass. They hit they hit chunk plays in that game to get points on the board. And that is just like Oregon back in the day, the way they're successful. They'll grind it out, and they're really just trying to move the sticks. They're trying to get 4 yards of play with a base offense, but they're trying to make you struggle so much to stop them from getting a first down that eventually you compromise yourself somewhere in the back end, and they pop you with a huge play. With Stidham as a quarterback, you think they'd be more successful to do with that kind of thing because they can pass the ball a lot better. But I think the problem is, one, and we touched on this last year, we took some real heat early, and I think people sort of warmed up to it. Stidham isn't dual threat enough to make teams fear him in the run. People have to respect him and his ability to scramble, but he's not Nick Marshall in that he can't carry the team running the ball. And I don't think Auburn's receiving core is good enough to threaten people straight up. And we only really have a one-game sample. I'm throwing Alabama State out because it's not, frankly, a real opponent at the line. It doesn't create a challenge. And I say that because in the Washington example, Auburn could not establish the run strong enough to make the other team compromise themselves. And what you see, it mirrors that red zone scoring percentage issue. They get first downs, they move the ball, they get yardage, but they never get the big chunk play. And when you get close to the line of scrimmage and you're really relying on a lot of lateral movement, the problem is now when you're on the 50-yard line and you snap the ball and a receiver goes downfield, that safety starts 15 yards out. He starts backpedaling and turning, and by the time the jet sweep motion hits, he's already 20, 25 yards downfield. And so if the corner or the linebacker isn't there, you get 10 yards before the safety can crash. When you're in the red zone, if you're on the 5-yard line and you run a jet sweep, the safety is never more than 15 yards downfield, and he starts 10 yards downfield. So anything you do, linebackers and safeties can crash almost immediately, and stuff gets way harder. They need verticality to threaten with their offense. And when they get in the red zone, because they lose that verticality, they lose that threat, they really need to rely on the power run and just sort of overwhelm you. And what we're seeing is the power run is struggling, and time again, that's been an indicator that their offense will have some issues.
All right, so if you know that going in, so last year we saw an Auburn offense really stall against a good LSU defense that finally was healthy at that point, and the game sort of slipped away. It seemed like limitations in play calling and capability, and there was a lot of the same struggles that Stidham had against Clemson. If going into this game you know these things, let's say they are legitimate issues. Let's say red zone is a legitimate issue and power run, the ability to execute the power run. And I know Auburn fans are going to disagree with this and say, Kam Martin's good and they're going to be able to get the running thing down. But let's say, for argument's sake, that they can't, or it's not what they're used to. Would your strategy be, as an offensive strategy, then you're installing this game plan against LSU, knowing the defense that they have, and knowing what little success Rozier, everybody says Rozier, it's Rozier to me. I don't care if that's how he pronounces it, it's Rozier. Anyway, what little success we saw him have against the LSU defense was stretching the secondary vertically. So, if based on all that we know already, if you take these potential negatives as reality, is your game plan that you're installing more of, we're going to try to score from the 30 and 40 yard line with deep chunk plays and not have to get into the red zone? Or is it business as usual and you execute your normal offense and you just try to get those plays methodically down the field and score inside the 10, 15 yard line?
Well, my answer to that is that you need to run your standard offense and you need to grind out a slow win, take your time, get drives, try to wear out the defense, and just try to get a win the same way you did against Washington. And if you want to know why that's my answer, what did Auburn do last year when they played LSU that caused them to lose in the second half?
A lot of slowly developing deep routes that never materialized.
Right. So they tried to hit chunk plays, forcing the issue downfield, throwing low percentage plays on second or third down and forcing bad yardage, right?
The Kevin Sumlin offense.
Right. So we've already seen to some extent what happens when Auburn tries to go away from their MO in this kind of game, in my opinion. And I think Stidham can execute those plays in theory. The problem is, as much as Miami had some success with that, and as much as we were critical of Miami in a lot of areas, Auburn does not have Amon Richards. And
right.
I'm not sure that Auburn has a cager either. That's not to say that Auburn's guys are bad by any means, but Amon Richards is an NFL receiver.
So is it something? Are you saying kind of it's a bad thing in both ways, where because they can't do the power run, they're also not going to be able to get those deep balls because those chunk plays are absolutely contingent upon being able to run that power run scheme?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And the thing I would caution is you say, well, we can't get these chunk plays because we're not running the ball inside. That doesn't mean you try to force the chunk plays. As much as I'm saying you need the chunk plays to score if you're Auburn, and that's the way you
They're
score.
relying on the run game.
Right. It is absolutely the run setting up the pass. And if you're Auburn and the run isn't working, you have to be stubborn with it. You have to keep attacking the run because almost always, if you're attacking a good defense and you run it at them enough, they will eventually get tired. It can break open. Just this past weekend, Clemson and Texas A&M. Texas A&M couldn't do anything on Clemson's front four really for a half. And it wasn't until they got them at least a little tired in the second half that A&M was able to run the ball and pass the ball with some effectiveness. And sometimes that's what it takes to win a ball game. But if Auburn goes straight to the pass the way they did last year, we talked about how many possessions they burned or threw away in that game by doing that. They're going to end up punting the ball a lot faster. They're not going to wear out LSU's defense, and they're not going to get the chance to win the game the way they maybe could.
All right, so now's the point in this show where I piss off LSU fans. Are you ready for that?
Sure. I mean,
so
I think you've pissed off everybody from every fan base at this point. We've been called a homer for everyone under the planet.
That's the funniest thing. What Josh just said. Every single week, y'all, whatever teams we're covering, even in the same video in the comment section, we're called homers for the opposite team from whatever the commenter is. So I take it as a badge of honor for our objectivity that everybody that follows our channel thinks nobody knows who our favorite teams are. They just think we're a homer for whatever their rival is. Okay, so we talked about this a lot last year with South Carolina. And LSU fans, I'm not saying your team is as bad as South Carolina or any of that. What I want to say, when South Carolina beat NC State last year, I think it was 35-28, or it felt like a bigger win than it actually was, because statistically, South Carolina got absolutely drilled by NC State. LSU did not get absolutely drilled by Miami, and some statistically of what Miami put on the board was late, especially with the deep ball, the chunk plays, just kind of 50-50 balls to the wide receivers, trying to get back into it, and not even that, really trying to make the score respectable. I think at some point they realized that they were not going to win that game, and they just wanted to put up a little bit of a number. And LSU actually was just trying. I think at halftime they came out, they put up I think 6 points in the third quarter, and they were like, let's shut it down because we know we got the win. But I will say this: LSU was 3 of 16 on third down, and Burrow was 5.8 yards per attempt, 11 to 24. And we talked about the chunk play in the run game. Offensively, so LSU scored 33 points. One score was on a pick six. Is it safe to say that, or I'll say this hypothetically, even though neither one of us are very high on Miami, if that game plays out, let's say 5 times, what are the odds that the other 4 are much, much closer scores, even if LSU wins every one of them? And what are your thoughts on whether or not this was a legit blowout win versus a couple of balls bounced for LSU in their favor and completely turned the game on its ear?
To a certain extent, I think you have to accept that game should have been closer than it was. And there's something to be said for winning a game where your defense gets interceptions and you turn that into points, and you win an ugly game, and knowing how to win an ugly game. But if you've watched our channel at all, something that we kind of preach is you can't be a slave to the data, and you have to understand how to interpret it. But when you have this sort of game with these stats, more often than not, the per play statistics, how the team does, when looking at all the statistics, is a lot more helpful than just looking at the score. That quite often the score, as much as win or loss is important, the score is not a very good indicator of future success. If we're predicting a future game, I want to look at the stats of the game, because that's what ends up repeating itself. Miami outgained LSU. They had a higher third down conversion percentage. They had a higher yards per pass. They had a slightly lower yards per rush, but it was 3.8 yards per carry to 2.4 yards per carry. What's worse is if you took out the 50-yard run from Brissett, that number is almost a dead wash. And then LSU was averaging under 3 yards per carry in that game. LSU won because Miami turned the ball over with 2 interceptions. Miami gave up chunk plays. Getting back to the Auburn point, chunk plays give points a lot more readily than slow possessions. If you're getting your yards if you get your yardage 6 yards at a time, what'll happen is you'll get 6 yards, 6 yards, 6 yards, 6 yards, tackle for a 2-yard loss, and then 6-5 punt. And so you end up leaving a lot of yardage on the ground. If you get your yardage in one 80-yard touchdown play, all 80 yards basically get converted into points, in a manner of speaking. LSU had a lot of sort of breaks go their way that generated points in that game. And I understand, too, LSU did sort of shut things down because they got a big lead and they did need to extend it. But my caution with that line of thinking is, at no point did LSU ever really have success throwing the ball down the field. So it's easy to say they shut it down, which maybe they did to a certain extent, but their offense was always going to try to grind out the win in that game. That's what Steve Ensminger does for the most part. I know there's a lot of spread concepts, but they were always going to try to move the ball slowly down the field in spread or non-spread, power run, what have you. They weren't going to try for chunk plays, and when they were early, it's not like they were successful. So I do think if you played that game out 5 times, it's probably not going to be that wide of a margin. If it's probably lower scoring on both sides, frankly, but a 16-point win isn't entirely deceptive given the way that game went. But certainly I think 33 points from LSU You don't normally have 3.8 yards per carry and 5.8 yards per pass attempt and actually generate 33 points. That was a lot of points from the statistical production they had.
Yeah, and here's something if we're continuing in this sort of pump the brakes a little bit, LSU fans. One of the things, tell me how concerned you are with this. And we don't draw a lot from games against Cupcakes. And in this game against Southeastern Louisiana, one of the things I'll say in LSU's favor, early in the year last year, obviously everybody remembers the Troy game, but they were playing ugly against crappy teams, other crappy teams, not just Troy, early in the year last year. So 31-0. I love that. I absolutely love going out there and handling your business on the scoreboard. Here's something that scares me a little bit, and I want you to touch on this in terms of what we saw versus what we should expect. They had Joe Burrow was, first of all, the only quarterback that played. And I understand in this offense you want to get your quarterback going since it's a new face. You want to give him as many reps as possible. But total yards, 335. We don't do a lot of total yardage here. We're per play kind of average. Third down efficiency, 4 of 11. This is all LSU numbers against Southeastern Louisiana. Here's the one that really scares me. Joe Burrow, 10 of 20, so 50% passing conversion rate, completion rate, 151 yards, 7.6 yards per attempt. I'm going to repeat that, let you digest it, and tell me what your thoughts are given the opponent was Southeastern Louisiana. 10 of 20, 151 yards, 7.6 per. I'll let you run with that for a minute.
So we talk a lot that if you want to be competent in the passing game, I usually put the number at about 7.5 yards per attempt. Anything below 7.5 yards per attempt in the passing game is ineffective. And anything over 7.5 yards per attempt tends to mean that the passing game is effective. So 10 of 20 for 151 yards. The first thing is every other pass is an incompletion. So why is that important? Well, it means at 7.5 yards per attempt, to sort of play it out, you would need 2 pass plays to get a first down. If every other yard is an incompletion, that means if you've had 3 pass plays in a row, one set of drives, because how do you split 3 plays by 2? You get 1.5. So what would it be is the first 3 plays, it's completion, completion, incompletion. And the next set would be incompletion, completion, incompletion. Basically, and every other set of 3 downs, one you complete 2 passes and one you complete 1 pass. So 7.5 yards per attempt. First set, you can get a first down, and the second set, often you're not going to. That's a problem. And it's a problem because it's hard to string enough completions together when you need them to move the sticks. And when you do get the completions, you're not necessarily moving the ball as much as you need to. Now, 7.5 yards per attempt means it's also 15 yards per completion, right? So in theory, every completion is a first down. I'm kind of fudging the numbers a little bit because it doesn't quite work out that way. Most plays are shorter, and then some are quite a bit larger. The average moves towards the larger plays. But again, that 7.5 yard per attempt number, it's not good enough to move the needle the way you need to move it to be successful. And I'm going to throw out a couple numbers here before I give it back to you. And that's looking at LSU's production per play in the first couple games this season compared to how it was last year. First, that 7.5 yard per attempt number and what that looks like. Well, that's slightly higher than what they had against Notre Dame. And it's slightly lower than LSU's production against Florida last year. That's what they got out of Burrow. It was 6.9 yard per attempt against Notre Dame, 7.8 yards per attempt against Florida. I think perhaps the more interesting numbers to me, it's total offense from LSU. They averaged 6.09 yards per play against Southeastern, and they had 4.55 yards per play against Miami. Those are not great numbers. And to put it in perspective, 4.55 yards per play, that would have been the second lowest yardage total that LSU had last season. The only time they were lower was against Alabama, and they had 4.2 yards per play. And that was, for example, Mississippi State last year, they had a higher per play average than they did against Miami this year. And then Southeastern even, Southeastern 6.09 yards per play. Where does that fall? Um, it's a little more per play than they had against Auburn. It's less than they had against BYU to open the year. So, kind of put it in perspective. I know it's a 2-game sample. We don't know how it all falls. There's backups. I get all that. But the per play yardage, from which is the thing we tend to look at, and we look at it because, if you're LSU, you're never going to have a ton of total yardage as LSU because you run the ball a lot, which burns clock, and you huddle, which burns clock. So you don't have nearly as many snaps or many plays. That works out defensively and offensively. That's why we kind of throw it away. You got to take tempo out of the equation. But per play, the thing we usually rely on screams to us that LSU offensively is not as good as they were last year. And that's the performances in these past 2 games have been behind pace from where they were last year, when I think a lot of people were not completely pleased with the offense.
And you can say, when you're saying last year, that's last year on average where 50% of your sample wasn't against directional schools from Louisiana.
Right. Their performance, let me put it a different way. Their performance average across the whole season was 6.2 yards per play last year. Across the whole season, of which 8 games is conference play. You have a bowl game. You had BYU out of conference. Their per play average against Southeastern Louisiana was lower than their season average was last year.
And I think LSU fans are probably like, guys, y'all hate our team. You're being really negative. And it's not the case. What we're trying to see is where your team stacks up against an elite team. And Auburn, the same thing. When we're picking against you, or not picking, when we're picking at you a little bit, trying to find these negatives, it's because you're going up against an elite defense. And I think that's fair to say. Based on what you've seen so far and what you know about the athletes on the LSU defensive side of the ball, would you say they're in that top 5 elite defense status?
I would, and I was about to interject that because we've had this discussion on the offense, because I think we all know the defense is good.
Right.
And we've probably spent too much time talking about the offense, but I think these numbers, we don't like to just say we don't think, we think the offense is great, we think it sucks. We're saying, look, these are the numbers. The average is worse than it was last year. Take it or leave it for what it is. But a lot of this discussion offensively is because we think both defenses are very good. And if either of these offenses have a weakness or they have problems, I think for both teams, they're going to be quickly exposed, because you may well be dealing with 2 top 5 defensive units in the same game.
Yeah, and I think LSU fans are probably going to come at us and say one of you picked us to lose Miami, and one of you didn't, and we killed Miami. And I'll say to LSU fans the same thing I said to South Carolina fans when we talked about the Georgia game, because all of their fans in the comments kept saying, we won 9 games last year, and you think that we're not going to be very good this year. And I said, well, look, you beat Tennessee by 6. You barely beat Florida. You lost by 10 points to Kentucky. So there's things hiding just below the surface that can sometimes be canaries in the coal mine, indicators or whatever. And right now, I don't question the defense. The defense was excellent last year. I think it's even better this year. I think, from what I've seen so far, I think the passing game has actually taken a step back from what was a pretty pedestrian passing attack last year. The thing I will say, though, from what I've seen in 2 games, I like Brissett more than I like Geis last year. Neither one of us were very high on Geis after filling in the shoes for Fournette. I think, and I like the idea of not doing the committee thing, and I'm sure that there will be a stable of running backs that get a bunch of carries, but I like LSU having one guy to lean on. But for me, and I think this is where we kind of get into our predictions a little bit, and without telling me your score yet, knowing that both defenses are good, and knowing that both of these teams have had some kind of hard-fought early week games, does it all just come down to quarterback? 2 good defenses, 1 good running back on one side, not a great running game for Auburn, but I'm guessing neither team is going to run the ball really well against the other defense. Does it just come down to quarterback?
Honestly, it probably does. I think scheme can affect things, and creativity. I will say I'd probably have a different response to a certain degree if Canada was still there as a play caller. I had a tremendous amount of respect for Matt Canada, what he was able to do with that offense last year. But if we're talking about a game where two teams are struggling, and we talk about this a lot, if we're ever predicting games where there's less than 24 points going to be scored on either side, if we're predicting a game that's within a score, you're talking about one play can decide the entire game. It's a coin flip. And we always say these are really volatile games. And first off, neither one of us bet or would suggest betting. But, for those that do, we always say, it's a terrible idea to bet on a game where you have two low scoring opponents, because the odds of being able to know exactly what's going to happen are really low, because any play can end up being the determining outcome of the game. If you have a good quarterback, you can make that play a lot easier, because if you've got that one guy that they bust coverage once in a game or twice in a game, those one or two scores, which are just one or two plays that the quarterback connects, can win you the ball game. And if you don't have a quarterback that can complete those passes, or that doesn't see them or get the ball out on time, that can, you can miss your opportunity to win the game.
Yeah, and we say this, and this is what LSU fans, I'm already doing your comment section for you. I know what you're going to say in some of these, so I'm pushing you to give me some fresh material, some fresh content, because this is what you would have said. What was Jarrett Stidham's second worst game? And if you look at all of his games last year, he had two absolute stinkers that were so far worse than the third worst game. What was that second worst game? First one was Clemson. It was LSU. That's what they're going to say. He was 9 of 26 for 165 yards. He didn't run it at all. So they're going to say you have the better quarterback, but that quarterback was trash against us last year. So what would you say to that?
Well, one, I would say they had a point. But two, the thing I would note, I mean, if I were you, I would just rip into Daniel all I could, because he certainly needs to keep his ego down a little bit. But
7-1, y'all. 7-1 against the spread.
Let's hope for all our sakes that doesn't continue. The thing that Auburn did in that game is, honestly, I blame Chip Lindsey. Malzahn got a lot of heat early on, and I think it was deserved for messing with the offense. But I think that game kind of showed maybe why he didn't trust Lindsey, and we talked about that a lot, that Lindsey had a reputation for being a very pass-heavy play caller. He took a lot of deep shots in that game.
Yeah, and I want you to continue to this point, and I want Auburn fans to comment if you're still staying with us this long. I want you to comment in the comment section, because I remember at some point in the season, Gus said, all right, I'm getting out of the offense. It's Chip Lindsey's offense. I can't remember if it was before or after the LSU game that he said he was fully getting out of it.
Right, and the point I kind of made coming out of that LSU game is, and it was a lot like the Clemson game in certain ways, they would have success, but then they would call shot plays and a lot of other plays in bad situations. And in particular, if they had a third and short, they were always going to run it. If they had a second and long, they were always going to throw it. And if you always throw on second and long and you're not converting many, that puts you in a ton of third and longs. And the predictability was kind of insane. And what that screamed was, at times, Malzahn was sticking himself in and saying, it's third and short. We got to run the ball. We got to get the first down here. We got to get the first down there. And it screamed an offense that didn't have a coherent plan or a single mind kind of thinking it through, and was just kind of getting interjected. And that created a lot of predictability. But the flip side kind of happened in the LSU game, because they got over aggressive. They got away from what they were good at. And when they were winning the game, and then they kind of tried to, quote, open it up, it didn't work. And they ended up throwing away way too many possessions, gave LSU a chance to get back in it, and then ultimately win the game.
All right, so I think we've gone plenty on this one. Let's get into our picks. Give me your score prediction on this one and tell me why you're predicting it that way.
Right, so my score prediction in this game is Auburn 17, LSU 13.
Y'all, we don't talk about these ahead of time. We never do. Alabama Louisville, I said 51-17 or 49-17, and you said 51-17. I think that's what you picked. My pick, sorry to interrupt, but my pick was also 17-13. Continue.
So it sounds like we're kind of on the same page here.
Yep.
I think this is a low scoring game, which means I don't have much confidence in this pick whatsoever. There's way too much volatility. Anytime the score gets below 20 points scored on either side, it's really volatile. And it really comes down to the fact that there are a lot of signs that LSU's offense is pretty one-dimensional. They're dependent on the run, and they're not running at a really high clip. I know they were successful against Southeastern Louisiana for the most part, but they were not dominant, and that was an FCS team. Now that's the only snapshot we have. So I'm drawing way more from that than I should, and I fully admit that fact. But looking at that and then looking at Auburn and where they're at, and like you said, it really comes down to the quarterback. I think Auburn may be able to hit one or two shot plays that turn into touchdowns or get a drive or two out of Stidham. And we're saying, and when I say 17-13, and apparently you say 17-13, we're saying there's only 3 touchdowns scored in the game.
Right.
So if Stidham can connect on 1 or 2 pass plays, that's all it's going to take to win. It wouldn't shock me if there's actually less touchdowns scored, if it's like the Washington
Field goal city.
Auburn game. Yeah, or the LSU Auburn game that ended up getting Les Miles fired, right? Which was another field goal city game where both defenses just keep the other teams out of the red zone. The difference is, I think, with the quarterback situation at Auburn being what they are, or what it is, really between the 20s, Auburn's going to move it better. And Auburn's going to get into scoring position probably more often because of Stidham. I think Stidham gets negated to a large extent in the red zone where the defense doesn't have as much room to cover, where Stidham doesn't have as much verticality to exploit or as much room to throw. But because Auburn gets in the red zone more, they're going to get a lot more scoring opportunities and be able to generate more points.
Yeah, I agree. And I said 17-13. It's a combination of two things for me. It's home game, and we know how Auburn played at home last year, and it's the quarterbacks. And right now, I'm not sold on Auburn's ability to run the ball. I think both of these teams' defenses are so good that it'll keep them in a game against anybody. But to me, like you said, one of these offenses is going to have to step up and make a play, and I'm going to go with the one that can throw it, because if you followed any of these elite defenses over the past 5 to 10 years, one of the things we know is nobody runs the ball. They get in these games, Alabama, Auburn, LSU defenses, good running teams still don't run the ball against the opposition. And you're saying there's some signs that even though LSU has put up some decent yardage with Brissett, that they may not be a great running team. And if they have a quarterback that's not performing, and and again, LSU fans, don't get mad, because all we're saying is it's reasonable to say that your quarterback is going to do poorer against an Auburn elite defense than he did against Southeastern Louisiana. And that may not be the case. He may come out fire. They may have been super vanilla all year so far, and we haven't seen this full offense. That's completely a possibility. But based on what we have, based on the data we have, I'm guessing he's not going to do better. I'm guessing he's going to be in the 5-ish yards per attempt, which means they are, like Josh said, not going to even do well between the 20s. But I will also say that I would not be surprised if LSU wins this game, because, as you said, at 17-13, that amplifies the impact that variability has on a game. The more plays and the more points that are scored, both teams sort of regress to their mean in terms of offensive and defensive production. But when it's 17-13, a special team score could be 33% of all the touchdowns scored that we're predicting in this game. A defensive score, or even a defensive short field, could completely flip this game on its ear. So LSU fans, don't get super mad at us. If you win this game, we would not be shocked, but I'm also going 17-13 Auburn. But like we've been doing so far this year, I want to ask you, if LSU wins this game, do you think the score is higher or maybe even lower?
I honestly think if they win the game, the score isn't going to be all that different. I will be genuinely surprised if either team, maybe not surprised, but I think it's unlikely either team crosses 20 points, and I would be very surprised if either team scores more than 25 points in this game. I think if that happens, this game probably, I won't call it a runaway, but it's probably pretty one-sided. But for the most part, I think both teams are going to struggle to score 20 points. And to your point, and I finally dug up the statistic that I was drawing from earlier with Auburn, and going back to the Clemson game of last year, in the second half of the Clemson game from last year, 9 of 10 second down plays were a pass play. And it was the same pattern they repeated against LSU. They got second down, they took a shot. If Auburn does that, they may not score very much. They may generate negative plays. LSU's defense is good. They're opportunistic. We don't quite know what they're going to look like without Chazon, so that's maybe one little caveat there. But right now, with guys like Ed Alexander and Rashard Lawrence and actually being healthy in the front four, they're going to be really good at stopping Auburn's front. So if Auburn throws away plays where they can't sustain drives, and in my view, more importantly, they don't get the starting defensive line from LSU off the field and rotating, they're going to have a hard time being able to move the ball, generate points. They're going to get tired. But if they're able to do that, they're going to keep driving. They're going to keep LSU off the field. Probably not a lot of plays run by either team. And I think, honestly, this game could be low scoring just from the aspect that both teams should run the ball a lot. They're not going to get a lot of plays, and they're just not going to be very many drives. It should be like 10 to 11 drives per team. Not, a hurry-up, passing offense games. Again, we rag on Petrino a lot because he'll have 15 drives in a game, and they score more points because they had the ball 50% more, but their opponent did too. And this isn't going to be one of those games. It shouldn't be a lot of possessions, and both teams should be keeping it close to the vest. And if they don't, I think it only helps the opponent.